Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're looking at something that I think is really fascinating.
Oh,
It's about the impact businesses have,
okay.
not just on the economy, which we kind of all get,
Right.
but on society
Yeah,
as
yeah.
a whole. And we've got some excerpts from a textbook about businesses in Australia.
Okay.
But even though the examples are all Australian, the ideas are totally global.
Okay.
So
For sure.
stick with us. I think you'll be surprised by what we find.
I think you're right. It's so easy to only think about businesses in terms of money, right?
And profits.
Yeah, exactly. But they really affect so much more than that.
Yeah.
It's like everything from the jobs they create to the cool new things they come up
But
with.
innovation.
Yeah, all of it just adds up and shapes how we live.
Absolutely. So it's like these ripple effects, right?
Yeah,
Okay, so we all know the basics of how an economy works. But what's so cool here is how businesses fit into the whole system, at least in Australia. And our source goes right into the impact on jobs. And wow,
Yeah.
it's pretty crazy.
Yeah, well, think about it. Employment is what makes the whole economy work,
I mean,
right?
people need to have jobs.
Exactly. People with jobs make money, then they spend that money, which supports businesses,
Yeah.
which leads to even more jobs.
That's a cycle.
Exactly. It just keeps things moving, and businesses are at the center of all of it.
Right at the heart of it.
And just to give you an idea, back in June 2021, over 5 million people had jobs at small businesses in Australia.
Wow.
And that's not even counting the medium and large companies. So,
That's huge.
yeah, it's a massive part of the population depending on businesses to survive.
Right, to make a living.
Exactly.
And then all those businesses, no matter how big or small, they pay taxes too, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And not just from their profits, but the taxes their employees pay too.
Yeah, totally. It's like a big web where everyone's contributing.
It's an interconnected web.
I like that. And all that tax money then goes to fund those super important services.
Like schools.
Yeah, schools, hospitals, roads, all that stuff.
Public services.
Yeah. Back in 2021, the Australian government got almost $25 billion in taxes from employers and employees,
Wow.
plus another $154 billion from taxes on goods and services.
Gosh, that's a lot.
It is. It just goes to show how important businesses are for keeping everything, running.
Totally.
Yeah.
Okay, but get this.
What?
Did you know that something like 60% of small businesses in Australia
Really?
don't actually have any employees?
Wow.
Yeah, it's all these solo entrepreneurs out there hustling.
That's wild. I had no idea.
It's inspiring, but I bet it's super challenging too.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Running a business, especially by yourself, takes a ton of
Grit.
yeah, grit and determination. But I think it also shows how much of an entrepreneurial spirit there is in Australia. And even though those solo businesses might not be creating jobs for other people directly, they're still a part of the economy in a bunch of other ways.
Absolutely. Okay, so speaking of contributing to the economy, we've got to talk about economic growth.
Right.
It's like the buzzword you always hear.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it always seems to be why things get more expensive over time.
Right. Inflation.
But seriously, how do businesses make that growth actually happen?
So economic growth basically means that a country makes more valuable stuff, like goods and services, over time.
Okay.
And it's usually measured by GDP or gross domestic product.
Okay.
And businesses, from those tiny startups to the huge corporations, are the ones making all those goods and services, right?
Oh, that's so, yeah.
Think about it. Every single thing you buy, every service you use, it all comes from a business doing its thing.
That's true.
And so as businesses keep getting better and bigger, that GDP number keeps going up.
It grows.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In 2019 and 2020, small businesses in Australia contributed over $422 billion to the country's economic output.
Wow, that's crazy.
It is. And when you add the medium and large businesses, it's super clear that they're the ones driving that growth.
They're the engine, so to speak.
You got it.
Okay, so we've got businesses making jobs, they're paying taxes, and they're pushing economic growth.
Right.
But what happens when they, go global?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Our source talks about this thing called the balance of payments.
Right.
And I'm not going to lie, I don't totally get it.
Well, it's actually pretty simple. Basically, the balance of payments is like a record of all the money coming in and out of a country, from international stuff. Like if a country sells more stuff to other countries than it buys from them, it has a positive balance.
So it's like a giant scorecard.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And a positive balance is usually a good thing. It means more jobs,
Right.
more money coming into the country,
That's
and
right,
just
yeah.
better living overall for everyone.
So it's like a constant give and take between countries. Okay. And companies like Rio Tinto, that big mining company in Australia, they're like the stars of this, right?
Yeah, for sure. They export iron ore all over the world and make over 90% of their money from overseas.
Wow, that's a lot of money coming back to Australia.
It is, and it's a perfect example of how even one company can massively impact a country's economy, you know?
Absolutely.
Mm.
And did you know that Australia has actually had pretty big current account deficits for a while?
Oh, really?
Yeah, which means they've imported more than they exported.
Interesting.
But in recent years, their exports have really picked up, so that gap's shrinking, which is good.
That's great to hear.
Okay, so we've got jobs, taxes, economic growth, global trade. We've covered a lot.
It's a lot.
But what about all the cool new stuff businesses are always making?
The innovations.
Exactly. Our source mentions something called R&D, research and development.
Right.
So what is that all about?
R&D is about trying new things, finding faster and better ways to do stuff, or even coming up with totally new things that solve problems we didn't even know we had.
That's cool.
It's how we progress, you know, and businesses are the ones driving that progress.
Yeah.
That leads to more efficient work, making more stuff, more jobs, and in the end, just a better quality of life for everyone.
That's awesome. And there's a great example like BlueScope Steel, that Australian company. They've been all about R&D for years.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, back in '66, their research led to this thing called color bond steel.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And it's used all over the world now in construction and stuff, so talk about a lasting impact.
That's really cool. It shows how R&D can have these long-term benefits, even though it can be super expensive, especially for small businesses.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And that's where the government steps in with programs like the R&D tax incentive. It helps offset some of those costs for businesses.
So it's like an investment in the future.
Exactly, and it seems to be working. Back in 2019-2020, businesses in Australia spent over $18 billion on R&D. Wow. Which is actually a 4% increase from just a couple years earlier.
That's great. But our source mentioned that bigger businesses usually spend way more on R&D than small businesses.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is? Is it just about having more money?
I think it's a bit of both, right? Big companies obviously have more cash to throw around.
Right.
But it's also about their long-term planning and how they're structured.
Well,
Small businesses are usually more focused on just surviving right now, and they might not have the time or the willingness to take big risks on R&D projects.
that makes sense.
But there are definitely tons of small businesses out there that are super innovative, so it's not a rule or anything.
It's like a balance, right? Between what you need now and what you want in the future.
Totally.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about how businesses impact the economy, but what about the social side of things?
Right, yeah.
They obviously have a huge impact on how people live in a country, so I'm really interested to dig into that more.
Yeah, me too. It's about way more than just having a job and making money.
Right. It's about how your job makes you feel and the connections you make at work
Yeah, yeah.
and how the business affects the whole community.
Totally. Social well-being includes so much more than just money stuff like GDP and employment numbers.
Right.
It's about having the things you need to live, like food and a place to live,
Okay.
good education and healthcare, being able to connect with people,
Yeah.
having a sense of purpose, even just feeling happy and fulfilled.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, it is. And businesses have a huge impact on all those things.
So in a way, they're kind of like architects of society, shaping how we live and work and interact with each other.
That's a really good way to put it.
Right.
Yeah, I think the more we understand that, the more we can hold businesses accountable for creating a society that works for everyone.
I like that a lot.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got the basics of how businesses and society are connected.
Right.
But I want to go even deeper. Like, how exactly do they impact social well-being besides just providing jobs? And what are some of the challenges that come with all this?
Those are great questions, and I think that's a perfect place to pick up in the next part of Dave Dive.
Perfect.
We'll look at how businesses can be both good and bad,
Okay.
and how we as individuals can navigate all this and make good choices about the businesses we support, so stay tuned.
I can't wait. This is getting really interesting. And for our listeners, I want you to think about the businesses you interact with every day, like as a customer, an employee, or even just someone who sees their ads.
Okay.
Which ones seem like they're really having a positive impact on society?
Yeah,
And what makes them different? We'll be talking about all this in the next part, so make sure you come back for that.
absolutely.
See you then.
Bye. Welcome back to our deep dive, everybody. We're looking at how businesses impact society, and it's a really interesting topic.
It is, for sure. And last time we were talking about how businesses can do good things through, like, corporate social responsibility.
Yeah.
But I was thinking, What about when businesses do things that are actually bad for society?
That's a good point.
Like we've all seen those headlines about companies doing shady stuff,
Yeah, for sure.
like polluting the environment or treating their workers badly.
Right.
And it makes you wonder, is making money all that matters to them?
It's a big question.
Yeah,
You've hit on something really important, though. Businesses, just like people, they're not perfect.
right,
They make mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes have big consequences.
for sure.
But I think it's important to remember that not all businesses are the same, you know?
Yeah.
Some companies really try to do the right thing, even if it means they might lose money in the short term.
Right.
And then there are others that just care about making as much money as possible, no matter what.
So it's not about saying all businesses are bad,
No, not at all.
but just realizing that there's a whole range of approaches and impacts.
Yeah.
Okay, so then for us as consumers, how do we tell the good companies from the bad ones?
That's the tricky part.
Is it all about doing research and only buying from companies that do good things?
It's definitely a big part of it.
Yeah.
You know, when people stop buying from companies that do unethical stuff, it sends a really strong message.
Right.
But it's not always that easy.
I know.
There's so much information out there. It can be overwhelming trying to stay on top of everything.
Like information overload.
It is. You have to think about so many things.
Yeah, like are they treating their workers fairly? What's their impact on the environment? Is their supply chain transparent?
Yeah, all of that.
It's a lot.
It is, but luckily there are some resources out there to help us.
Okay, what kind of resources?
There are websites, apps, even things you can add to your web browser that rate companies based on how socially and environmentally responsible they are.
It's like having an ethical shopping assistant in your pocket.
Exactly.
Okay, I like that.
And I think it's important to remember that we have power as consumers beyond just buying or not buying things, you know?
Right.
We can ask questions, demand transparency, and hold companies accountable for their actions.
So we're citizen detectives. I like that. Gathering evidence and using our collective voice to push for change.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about businesses being responsible.
Right.
But what about our responsibility as consumers?
Good point.
Like, do we have a moral obligation to support ethical companies?
It's a big question. Even if it means paying more or going out of our way to find those companies.
It's tough because we've all got budgets to think about
Yeah.
and limited time and resources.
It's a question everyone has to answer for themselves. There's no right or wrong answer. I
Right.
think it comes down to what's important to you and what you prioritize in your life.
So it's about finding a balance, right?
Exactly.
Between doing what you feel is right and what's actually possible for you.
Yeah, and maybe the most important thing is just being aware of how your choices impact things
Right?
and trying to make sure your spending aligns with your values whenever you can.
It's a journey, not a destination.
Well said.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about businesses and consumers, but what about the government? What role do they play in all of this?
That's a really important point. I think governments have a big responsibility to create rules and regulations that encourage businesses to be responsible.
So sometimes it's not enough to just host companies will do the right thing on their own.
Yeah, sometimes we need laws and policies to protect consumers, workers, and the environment.
So it's like a checks and balances system.
Exactly.
Businesses have the power to do good,
Right.
but governments need to make sure that power isn't being abused.
I agree.
It's a delicate dance, for sure.
It is.
But when it works, it can be really good for everyone.
Right. Businesses do well, society benefits, and the planet is protected.
It's a win-win-win.
It is.
Okay, before we wrap up this part, there's one more thing I wanted to touch on.
Okay, what is it?
We've talked about how businesses impact society,
Yeah,
but doesn't society also impact businesses?
absolutely. It's a two-way street, for sure.
Right, so businesses don't operate in a vacuum. They're constantly responding to what's happening in society.
Exactly. Things like what consumers want, social norms, and cultural trends. Businesses are always adapting to those things.
So in a way, we as consumers have the power to influence how businesses behave.
I think so, yeah. The choices we make, the things we buy, the values we express, they all send signals to businesses about what we expect from them.
It's like a feedback loop.
Exactly. We influence them and they influence us.
That's interesting.
And the more we understand that, the better we can use our power to make things more sustainable and fair.
I love that. It's empowering to know we're not just sitting back and watching. We can actually make a difference.
We can. And the more people speak up, the more businesses will listen.
Okay, so I think we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
From how companies can be socially responsible to the big picture impact of business on society and how society impacts business.
It's a lot.
It has been a fascinating conversation.
I agree. I hope our listeners are feeling inspired.
Me too. But before we move on, I have one last question for you.
Okay, shoot.
This is a big one, so get ready.
All right, bring it on.
If you could magically change one thing about how businesses operate in the world today, what would it be?
Oh, wow. That is a big one.
I know it's a tough one.
But it's a really good question and one that I think about a lot.
Okay.
If I could change one thing, it would be to make every business leader truly care about what's called the triple bottom line.
The triple bottom line, what's that?
So it's not just about making as much profit as possible anymore.
Okay.
It's about considering people and the planet as well.
So it's like a more holistic approach, thinking about everyone involved, not just the shareholder.
Exactly. I really believe that when businesses prioritize people and the planet along with profit, it creates a much better situation for everyone in the long run.
I like that, but how do we get there?
It's a tough question.
Yeah.
I think it takes both education and bigger changes to the system.
Clear.
We need to teach business leaders about why sustainable and ethical practices are good for everyone, but we also need to create rules that reward those practices and punish those who don't follow them.
So it's about changing how people think and also changing the rules of the game.
Exactly. It's not easy, but I think we can do it if we work together.
I'm with you on that. Now, before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, I have one last thought for everyone listening.
Okay.
As we go about our lives, interacting with businesses every day, let's remember that we actually have the power to make a difference.
I do.
Every choice we make, every dollar we spend, it all sends a message.
It does.
So let's be thoughtful about our choices and support the businesses that are trying to make the world a better place.
I agree.
It's about putting our money where our values are.
Well said. Okay, I think it's time to wrap up this part of our discussion, but don't worry, we'll be back soon with even more insights and things to think about.
Until then, keep learning, keep asking those tough questions, and keep exploring these ideas.
Absolutely.
All right, welcome back, everyone. So we've been talking about all the ways businesses impact society, and in this last part, I want to look at how it all fits into, like, the bigger picture.
Okay, sounds good.
And earlier we mentioned how businesses don't exist in isolation.
Right, they're constantly being influenced by society.
It's like this two-way street. They shape society and society shapes them.
Yeah, exactly. It's a really interesting relationship that people don't always think about.
I know. So let's break it down a little. What are some ways that society actually influences what businesses do?
Well, just think about something as simple as what people want to buy, like consumer demand.
Right.
Businesses are always trying to figure out what people need and want,
Yeah.
and then they change their products or services to match.
Makes sense. I got to keep up with what people are into.
Exactly. It's all about supply and demand.
If people aren't buying what you're selling, you're not going to stay in business very long.
Exactly. So that's why it's so important for consumers to realize that they have power.
Yeah.
Every time you buy something, you're basically saying, this is the kind of world I want.
I like that. It's like we're all investors in a way,
I like that too.
putting our money behind the businesses that match our values.
Exactly.
Okay, but it's not just about what we buy, right? Our source also mentioned that things like social norms and cultural trends can change how businesses act.
Oh, absolutely. For example, think about how much more people care about climate change and sustainability now.
Right. Everyone's talking about going green.
And because of that, so many businesses are trying to be more eco-friendly.
Yeah.
Even if it means they make a little less money in the short term.
So it's like we're all pushing businesses to be more responsible.
I think so.
And it's not just about the environment either.
Right.
Like, think about the push for more racial justice and gender equality. Those movements are changing how businesses operate, too.
Absolutely. They're having a huge impact.
Businesses are always changing to reflect what society values.
Yeah, they have to if they want to stay relevant.
And that's why it's so important for all of us to stay informed and involved.
I agree.
Our voices actually matter. We can help create the kind of businesses we want to see in the world.
That's a great point. It's really empowering.
It is, right?
Yeah.
It's so cool to know that we're not just along for the ride.
Yeah.
We can actually hold businesses accountable and encourage them to do better.
I think the more we talk about these things, the more positive change we'll see.
Okay, so as we wrap up this whole deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought.
Okay.
Business and society are super connected in this really complex way.
Yeah,
But one thing's for sure, we're all in this together.
we are.
It doesn't matter if we're consumers, employees, investors, or just people living in the community.
Right.
The choices businesses make affect all of us.
They do.
So let's all stay informed, stay involved, and keep working towards a world where businesses are a force for good.
That's a great message to end on.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone.
It's been great exploring these ideas with you, and for our listeners, remember to keep thinking about these things and keep making a difference.
Absolutely. See you next time.